Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kim Strom. I'm the Director of the Office of Ethics and Policy here at UNC, and I am really thrilled to welcome you and appreciative of you joining us for this event, which is the first event of Global Ethics Month. Global Ethics Day is October 16th, but not to be outdone with just a day. We have a month full of activities planned, many in partnership with the Parr Center for Ethics and other units on campus as represented here today. I'll tell you a little bit about those events now as folks are logging on. An event that we have scheduled for next week is on leading and healing in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. Our panelists include Chancellor Measer, who was the chancellor at UNC at the time, Justin Young, who was the head of student government at the time, former students who helped to lead student groups, and also folks who work with the Muslim community and around issues of Islamophobia. And it will be, I think, a great chance to both look at how we experienced that, how we experienced the pushback about the summer reading program and the aftermath of that. And so that will be one of the events. I'll be doing a talk on moral courage and exemplars of moral courage and whether those help us. We'll be having an ethics bowl with our students and the Parr Center students discussing payment for student athletes and also universal basic income on campus. And Dawn Osborne Adams is going to talk about leaders creating community. So we have a number of events, and I invite you to check out our website. And I know that during the time that we're on here, Matt or Tristan will put up the link to the future events. But today, to kick this off, a very important and timely discussion on the consumer ethics and the issues of ethics and our idols. And we'll give a little introduction, but first I want to invite our three panelists who've kindly shared their time and wisdom with us. I'll let them start. And Melinda, why don't you go first, and then Christy, and then Eric.
Hi, my name is Melinda Manning. I am currently the director of UNC Health's Beacon program, which is a program that works with both patients and employees who've experienced some form of violence or abuse. Also, I'm on campus a bit because I teach a little at school social work.
Hi, everybody. I'm Christy Hurt. I am recently back to campus as the inaugural Senior Prevention Strategy Officer, where I oversee student wellness and our Interpersonal Violence Prevention Collaborative, which is an emerging unit here in student affairs. I also teach in the School of Government, teach communications class over there, and it's great to see you all. Thanks for being here today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Eric, and I'm a faculty member in the philosophy department here at UNC, and I'm also a faculty member of the philosophy, politics, and economics program here. Just want to thank Kim for the invitation and for organizing this panel.
Thank you all. And I believe that through the miracle of technology, you've gotten the notice, the informed consent of our recording today. There's no perfect time. And so for holding an event in such a vibrant environment as we live and work in, so we've recorded this that we will share with colleagues. And I will also, our plan for this session is to have it be very conversational and to really try to probe the considerations on this topic. We'll converse for about an hour and invite your questions in the chat and kind of make sure we have plenty of time, up to 30 minutes for a Q&A at the end. So let me set the context here. Melinda and I have actually written a bit about this, the Me Too movement's emphasis and effect in elevating longstanding concerns about interpersonal violence and gender-based violence it's been significant, and certainly notable politicians and public figures from all areas of public life have been implicated in the Me Too movement. So it's a vast topic, and for the purpose of today's discussion, and in light of the expertise that we have on the panel, we have narrowed it to focus on discussing the ethics of purchasing products from authors, artists, athletes who have been credibly implicated in interpersonal violence. So sort of several filters there, the filter of interpersonal violence and the filter of which population we are focused on. And so we'll use the next hour or so to really kind of unpack some of our the considerations and again, invite your additions. So let me kick it off. The R. Kelly case, which I think concluded within the past week, seems a good example of our topic. R. Kelly, very well-known musician, and in his sphere, groundbreaking and influential as a trailblazer for his music, recently convicted, among other things, for sex trafficking and other crimes. So what are the ethical considerations if I choose to purchase his music? And so I'll ask, sort of as a kickoff, for each of our panelists to weigh in and talk to me about some of the considerations. And I don't know who would like to go first. Eric, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'd love to. I guess before we get into a list of the considerations that I would deem to be relevant, I would just like to invite all the panelists and the participants to maybe engage in a little imaginative exercise, if you will, right? So, close your eyes if you want to, or don't close them, that's fine. But I would like you to retrieve from your memory a piece of work, artistic work, that you really love and you really admire, right? So this could be a beautiful painting that evoke a sense of sublime in your, in your heart or in your mind. It could be a beautiful poem that move you to tears when you first read it. It could be a novel. It could be a scene in a movie that really moved you or really touched you. Whatever it is, try to keep that piece of work in your mind. Now imagine, suppose tomorrow you read from the New York Times headline that the author behind this piece of work it has been revealed that this author has done some really morally problematic deed in the past, and perhaps rising to the level of seriousness of interpersonal violence, right? So here's just a question that I think is important for us to consider. Now go back to the piece of work that you held in your mind, be it a painting, a poem, a novel, or a movie scene. Ask yourself the question, in that short time where I reviewed this past wrongdoing on the author's part, do you have a different view about the quality of that work, right? So this is an important question for us to consider when we engage in this topic. And the question just it brings out the issue whether the artistic quality of a piece of work is dependent upon the moral character of the author who created that work. So that's just a question I would like you to consider. I'm not going to give an answer. But let me just proceed with some other considerations, right? So the first thing I want to make is the quality of an artistic piece of work is not the only consideration we should take into account when we make decisions about, say, whether to purchase an artist's product or work, right? So that is not the only consideration that's at issue. Here's just some considerations that I think is relevant. When we think about a case in which the artist, the athlete, or the musician has engaged in some seriously morally problematic behavior, and we're confronted with a decision about whether to purchase a work from them, one thing we should consider is the causal effects of our decision to purchase, right? Here's what I mean. Does our money go directly into supporting this artist or an athlete or a musician, right? Do we make a financial impact on the well-being of this person? So that's one thing to consider. Another causal impact to consider is, suppose we judge in our best opinion that we should boycott this artist? Well, by refusing to make a purchase, maybe we can set an example for others and lead them to join in our cause to boycott the artist at issue. So these are two causal effects of the choices we make when we act as consumers. Here are some perhaps less obvious consideration. One is our choices carry representative value, right? A lot of times, just give a mundane example, by deciding what to wear, I make a statement about who I am as a person, right? So if that choice represents me and I want to make a certain statement, and I think this can be generated to cases of one's choice in music, one's choice in reading, they actually represent you as a person. What kind of music you listen to, or which brand you would like to support, which musician you support, will have representative value. It represents you as a person. So this raises the question, would you like to associate yourself with someone who has committed serious interpersonal violence? The next consideration I want to table is symbolic value of our choices. Sometimes our choices are not really about ourselves and how we conceive ourselves or represent ourselves, but taking a symbolic stance for a certain cause that we believe in, even when others might not follow suit, right? So that's just symbolic value of the choices we make as consumers. And I will conclude by giving one last consideration, which might be relevant, is for me personally, when I reflect on the choices I make when it comes to artists or musicians or athletes who has made morally problematic choices in the past, is I hold in my mind clearly the experience of the victim. And I imagine someone who tell me, sort of, if you bring the victim in your mind, who says, how could you keep supporting this person? Now, I might never meet the victim in person, but this sort of vicarious thought or putting myself in the other person's shoe will tell me something about how I should decide as a consumer, whether my choice will be justifiable to the victim if I were to meet the person. Even in reality, I probably would never meet them. So thank you.
Super, thanks. Christy?
Yeah, that was a fantastic setup. Eric, thank you so much for all of that. I come at it sort of from the opposite direction, right? But end up in some of the similar places as you, with lots of questions to ask. And so I've been an advocate and working in the field of violence prevention for my whole adult life. And so what signal I send to a survivor potentially, and I wouldn't of course know who those folks are, has always been really important to me. So I don't want to be a walking trigger. I don't want to be a walking sort of barrier to someone accessing service. So I've always kept in my mind, like, if I'm going to play someone's music or wear that t-shirt, I'm sending a signal on some level of that personal endorsement, right? What you've talked about is a symbolic value. And so I've always tried very hard to not don the attire of someone who has been in the public sphere, is known as having potentially done some wrong to harm another person, because I feel like it'll harm the work and the support that I want to give to survivors. So I think that that's very much where I start. I've also really come from the perspective that to end violence, we need to be looking at all of the community conditions and the sort of messages that we send each other on a daily basis around what we condone and what we support, just in terms of our own interactions. So beyond being a trigger or a barrier sort of for survivors seeking services or support, I also think by purchasing or engaging with material or art in any way that promotes this notion of, if you will, a rape culture or a culture that condones violence, we're sending a signal that goes in the opposite direction of the other work that I want to do to change our culture to be more proactive, more supportive, more harm-free. And so I want everyone to take every opportunity they have to send signals that promote health, well-being, growth, and safety, as opposed to even taking those little moments to play a song or listen to music or engage in art that would send a contrary signal. And I'll give an example. While I personally will choose where my dollars go and how I support different forms of industry that might impact this space, which is of course everything, I've been less censor oriented when it comes to my own children. And when my kids were teens and would play problematic music or what I would deem problematic music, and I often wouldn't know who the artist was necessarily, right? Because that's not my jam. But I might have some discomfort with their lyrics or something like that. I wouldn't stop my kids from playing it, but I would pause it and I would give them a little spiel. And this became our thing. So I was like, if you can listen to that music that has words in it that I don't want to hear, but what I'm going to talk about for a few minutes while we pause that is healthy consent, affirmative consent. I'm going to talk about LGBTQ rights. I'm going to talk about how we treat other people. I'm going to talk about sexism. And I would try to counterbalance what they played with these other sorts of more healthy sort of, if you will, ethics or lessons, so they could make then more informed choices. And so while I certainly do make choices to not engage in a material that I would find harmful or would value or virtue signal in a way that I'm not comfortable, I don't go so far as to censor others, including my own offspring, but instead try to provide a moment of opportunity and growth so they can make good choices as they get older. And I think that you've really provided us with a great framework to jump off for this conversation today. And I appreciate that. And I think this conversation is going to be really rich and important. So thanks for the opportunity.
So Christy, I'm sure your kids were really psyched once they got their driver's licenses and could take themselves to school.
But their tastes have shifted, I am happy to note. So
That's
some of
good.
that has evolved over
Excellent.
time.
It's a win for parenting. All right, Melinda.
Thanks to both of you for really kind of laying a good foundation for this discussion. A couple other things. Well, first, I had a conversation the other night with a friend who said, well, can't you give us like a magical formula for figuring this out? So I want to tell the audience, if you came to this expecting a magical formula for figuring all this out, you're going to be sorely disappointed because we certainly have not come up with one, because I think it's just way too complicated issue. And I think it's an issue that is continuing to change. So just a couple of points that I think we haven't really touched on is that one thing that always comes to mind for me, we certainly have the artists who have been credibly accused and the artists who also have been now convicted in the case of R. Kelly. But then we also, all the artists who may have committed sexual misconduct that we don't even know about. So there also can be that we may be consuming works of art that from artists that have also committed acts of violence that we don't yet know about or may never know about, just to kind of add a whole other wrinkle to this. I think there's also, I also want to acknowledge that sometimes it really can kind of hurt in a way when you learn that an artist, has done some horrible acts, and then you then feel like you can no longer consume their products in some way. So I acknowledge the kind of hurt that can feel like, even though you may be someone who's a strong advocate for all survivors, at the same time, you can feel some very conflicted feelings because you no longer can watch your favorite movie or listen to a particular artist, et cetera. I know one thing that, one way I compared this to several years ago when the allegations came out about Senator Al Franken, who was a senator that I personally was very fond of. And actually at the time, my sister had just lent me one of his books, and I actually gave that book away because I just did feel so morally conflicted about reading it. But I want to acknowledge that there can be kind of a pain in that too. Another thing else I just want to bring up the fact that what makes things even more complicated, that we've really kind of focused on kind of singular artists, but let's talk about, say, an actor who appears in an ensemble piece. So I'm thinking about the Cosby Show for one, where we certainly know that at this point, Bill Cosby was convicted, even though his conviction was overturned on technicality. It wasn't to say that he was found innocent, as some commentators have said. That's not what happened. But what some people have pointed out, that when you stop watching the Cosby Show, you are also just not, certainly you're taking a stand by not watching, Bill Cosby, but also recognizing that it was an ensemble work and that the other actors may have not engaged in sexual misconduct. Another piece of that, a thought that a friend expressed to me a couple of weeks ago that was challenging to her in particular in terms of boycotting the Cosby Show, was, as a Black woman with Black children, recognizing that there weren't a lot of other choices to show her family in terms of Black family-friendly entertainment, and having to kind of balance that out. But back to this idea of, you then, because of, say, one actor having to choose not to watch an entire movie. And therefore, in a way, you could almost argue the way it's almost like punishing the other actors in that movie. And it brought up to me a concept from criminal law that we talk about called the fruit of the poisonous tree. And the idea of that is that if a piece of evidence is obtained illegally, then in court, you can't use any evidence that came from that original piece of illegally obtained evidence. And so as a result, very often in criminal court cases, where you have perfectly good evidence that could certainly lead to a conviction, can't be used because it is fruit of that poisonous tree. And that kind of reminded me the same way, is that where you could have the misconduct of one artist really suddenly kind of poisoning an entire piece of work. And, you could certainly argue that maybe is not fair to all the others who simply did not commit acts of misconduct. At the same time, I personally don't go see a Woody Allen movie, right? Because, we do know, even though he hasn't been convicted of anything, it's pretty credible that he, did certainly commit some sexual misconduct. But that thought certainly does come back to me that, am I also kind of means that also not consuming the art of others in those movies who did not presumably commit sexual misconduct. So that's kind of all the thoughts I have on that right now.
Super. Eric, your thought experiment at the beginning, what I envisioned, it was the first thing that came to mind was the painting Guernica by Picasso, which not a late Picasso fan, but having seen it in person and knowing of the bombing of Guernica, the destruction, it was incredibly powerful. But I'm going, and I'm not a Picasso scholar, but I'm pretty sure he might fall into the category. So that's your thought experiment, at least for this viewer, did the trick. So it raises some other concepts that I'd be interested in your thoughts. So one has to do with, does the time period in which the person lived matter? So I'm thinking of Ernest Hemingway or Joan Crawford. We don't want to only focus on sort of male perpetrators versus Bill Cosby. And I know I'm reflecting my age now, right? With when Bill Cosby is my recent example. But so does the time period in which the event took place matter? And I've got a bunch of questions, but does buying new media versus watching? So if I get that I may not love Cosby reruns because of this thing hanging over the hurt or the upset, but what does my boycott or my decision not to consume that matter to something that's been out for 30 years versus buying some new Cosby product or something that he gets royalties from? So I don't know if I don't know if those considerations matter, but I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I would take a stab at this, and please feel free to join in the other panelists. So let me, I guess I would just sort of take the 2 points in order. In terms of time period, there is a case, so there is a situation in which I think time period does matter for the following reason. Some philosophers argue that when it comes to assessment of the moral character of a person, that assessment should be sensitive to how difficult it was for the person to grasp what we now take to be self-evident moral truth, right? So time period might matter in the sense that it might be unreasonable to expect someone, say, from ancient Greece to truly grasp the ideal of gender equality, for example, right? So time period will obviously matter in that sense, but obviously there's a low-hanging fruit. That's the easy answer to your question, but I'll leave it at that. I don't think I can go. I don't think I can go any deeper than that. And your question about boycott really sort of raised a question for me, which is this, right? I'm just going to take a non-interpersonal violence example, but many think large corporations like Amazon are very morally problematic, right? So they engage in hiring practices or working conditions that many people see as objectionable. Now, here's a question that everyone should think about. Does Amazon really care whether I, as one person, as one consumer, buy the product on Amazon or some other avenue, right? That kind of question just raises the point about futility. Sometimes we would think, as individual consumers, large corporations is not going to care whether I, in this one instance, will buy their product or not. So in terms of the causal effect of our consumer choices, these kind of futility considerations really should be clear on mind. But even there, I think sort of some of the other considerations I introduced, such as the representative value of a choice or the symbolic value of a choice, could give us strong reasons to sort of maybe perhaps not buy products from Amazon, even knowing that my decision is not going to make an impact, even knowing that the majority of Americans probably wouldn't follow me in boycotting Amazon, if the statistics or empirical data bears out. There's one last thing I would like to say. I feel like I'm taking up too much time, but I would just say one last consideration, which is one of the concepts or one of the notions that I think we should bear in mind when we have this discussion is a particular feature of social change. So I think the Me Too movement provides a good illustration that a lot of times social change slow is like a trickling, the pace is very slow, but other times social change can really take the form of a tidal wave. Like it's somehow, for some reason, things are just happening really fast, and certain issues just become very vivid in people's minds. I think it is precisely at these kind of tidal wave moments, if you will, that our voices and our choices has the biggest impact when the issues are at the forefront of public discussion, when the issue is at the forefront of people's minds, really taking perhaps a symbolic stance in these time periods will perhaps amplify the significance of our choice.
Great, thank you. And so the other piece, the question of causality, I think, is what's the outcome that we choose to, do we want to hurt Bill Cosby, or do we want to protect someone who may have similarly experienced abuse, who seeing us in our Cosby sweater might be, so the different ends would suggest different in actions. Great. Other thoughts about the question of, does time matter, and does the existing media versus past media matter?
I just have a question sort of about it, or something else to consider, or an observation of my own experience, which is, if I, at the first point, consume the art with an awareness of the artist's history, right? Like an Ernest Hemingway or something like that, that feels different to me than absorbing a message from someone and then making the pivot once I realized that they were a harm doer. And I just want to point out that I think that shift often feels painful. And maybe this is to Melinda's point about sort of carrying that emotion of, watching Kevin Spacey, right, comes to mind. One of my favorite movies is The Usual Suspects. And then to take that sharp left turn and realize I can't really feel so great watching it anymore. So it's less about sort of my ethical policy issuance here around what should or should not be, but that if I consume the art with the awareness of what that person's history was, that feels a little bit more like it's like the full faith and credit or something of what I'm doing in the first place, as opposed to feeling like I've had to shift my mental frame around who that person is and what they've done to hurt others, which also, of course, begs the question, which goes back to another one of Melinda's early points, which is, we don't know who all of the people are in our communities who hurt others. We never will, but we know it's a lot more than ever come to light. And so it makes me wonder, sort of out loud, if I'm assuming everybody's a good human when I consume the art in the first place, that's what makes me take that left turn. But if I really ground myself in the awareness that people are complicated, they do bad things, and they also produce art, what would that do to my framework before I engage in the first place, before I'm disappointed? So I just want to put that out there as a little bit more confusion or muddying in the water.
It makes sense. And part of what you're talking about, The Usual Suspects makes me think of the point of ensemble. Maybe I should just focus on Gabriel Byrne and not on
Exactly.
the Kevin Spacey character, as I would like to do anyway. But the other piece is also, I think you're getting to our, not just the hurt that Melinda talked about, but our own personal diminishment. Am I diminished in my moral standing if I want to consciously kind of associate with this artist or actor? Melinda, did you have anything you wanted to add to those two questions? We kind of those around a bit.
Yeah, I want to, the first one about the time period is that should we judge artists in kind of context of the time period, is that I want to point out, it almost seems like we have a double standard, because when it comes to slavery, right, we could argue that certain historical figures, we shouldn't, the same argument you'd say, well, we should say it's okay they had slaves because that's what was in that time period. So to me, we should have the same standard. If we're going to say that we think it was immoral to have owned slaves, no matter what the time period, then we should say the same thing for these artists. It's immoral to hurt others or to commit acts of violence against women, no matter what the time period. We should have the same standard. I think too often we kind of put sexism and the violence associated with it to the side, right? And I think we shouldn't do that. So that's kind of the first point I really want to make. And I think the original point that we talked about, there's kind of, the main reasons why we would not consume, certainly we might not want to give money to the artists that commit. It's kind of, we don't want to trigger survivors who see us consuming that. And I think that's a particular issue for Christy and I and others who are kind of have leadership roles in the anti-violence movement. That's something that I know that I think I'm particularly conscious of. But I think the third one that we've kind of touched on is that it's also kind of your own moral sense of self. What can you personally live with as well? That kind of peace of mind piece, which I think you shouldn't discount. I know that's one that I think one of the ones I personally struggle with is Michael Jackson's music. I mean, we know pretty much without a doubt that he was, he molested children, right? But that's also music I grew up on. It's music you dance to. It's been associated with a lot of happy periods in my life, and that's one that I personally really struggle with. And I think coming up with a framework for yourself that you can kind of personally find some peace with these choices, I think is incredibly important as well. And the last point, to Christy's point, should we assume that everybody's good people or not? I mean, I'll just say as a social worker, I try to assume good intentions, but that is challenging because we know that statistically, there are many more of our artists and leaders and athletes who've committed, IPV than have been exposed. There's many, many more of them. And I suspect in years to come, there's going to be even more disclosures. I've been thinking about the brave US gymnast and their disclosures. What's that going to lead to in terms, particularly in the world of women's sports, is going to lead to that as well. So I think we're going to have, I don't think this is going away anytime soon. I think we're going to see additional ones.
Great.
Kim, I wanted to jump in. We've got a question in the chat.
Yes, thanks.
Yeah, so Kim Stahl says, the question of futility seems to be valid, but it also seems to be used in a lot of situations to simply excuse doing something that feels wrong, like buying a product that supports Cosby or Amazon. It gives us a reason to just do the easy thing. Is there a litmus test for this won't advance a goal, so it's futile, versus I'm just buying this thing because I want it?
So I'll just say a quick thing about futility, if I may, because in my research on moral courage, the reason sometimes a common reason that people don't speak up either in interpersonal situations or in whistleblowing type situations, wrongdoing, is no, it won't make a difference. The situation's already wired. And so the question is, and when I interview whistleblowers, what they say is right is right. It was the right thing to do. And also when you look at situations like the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, which went on for 40 years, it might have been there were a lot of futile actions, but eventually something tipped the scales. And so, and part of what I think about, and I was thinking about in terms of Eric's point about the right time for social change and whether something's a moment. Sometimes I look at those and think these are a bunch of bandwagon jumpers that just, oh, they didn't care about this until everybody cared about it. And now they're just behaving performatively. Now that's me being a bit cynical and whatever. So, because I think, right, if it's the right thing to do, you should do it even if someone's not watching. But I don't know if I helped with Kim's question or muddied it, but I'm interested in what the experts have to say.
Okay, I'm definitely not an expert, but I'll just say, I think the futility argument, I think there's always a thing to think about that if you take a stand, maybe others will see you and also take a stand as well. And I think we shouldn't ever underestimate that point as well. Is that's how one way how social movements get started. You know, somebody, you know, doesn't move to their seat at the back of the bus, right? That may seem futile, that one action, but we know what that led to in the civil rights movement. So, you know, and it doesn't always, you're right. I mean, not buying that toilet paper on Amazon, you know, may seem like you're doing nothing. But again, if you particularly you take a stance and you talk to others about why you're doing it, I think is that second piece that makes it feel a little less futile in the moment.
Other thoughts about futility?
I won't be able to solve it because the futility argument is a huge issue, and actually it's not confined to you know, a consumerism context. Think about voting in elections, right? It's very easy to get yourself in the mindset that I'm just a single vote within millions and millions of Americans. What are the chances that my vote is going to make a difference? Or think about individual choices when it comes to climate change. You might think, if I just cut down some of my emissions, but like there are huge polluters out there, corporations and even countries, what's the chance that my individual decision will ever make an impact on the climate crisis? So this is just to say the futility argument has sort of, if you accept it, it has wide application, and you know, many people. Some of the point that's being brought up, you know, are some of the responses to it, which is, look, perhaps if you just look at your choice in isolation, it's not going to make an impact. But don't forget that. First of all, there's a chance that it might actually tip the balance. Also, by doing this, you signal to others that they may join you. In addition, you know, don't just make a choice, but explain to others why this is the right choice to make. So all these are, you know, sort of good responses. I mean, it's made a bit trickier if you add in one little more detail, which is a lot of time in these futility arguments, your choice is not cost-free, right? So imagine a whistleblower who sort of correctly judges that even if I speak up, you know, no one's going to listen, the government's going to shut it down. Now, the choice to speak up actually is not cost-free. They might get fired for this. So in terms of individual rationality and self-interestedness, there's an argument to be made that, you know, not only is it futile, you actually face some undesirable consequences for it. But once again, like I don't think we can. I'm not able to resolve the issue.
I will say many of the whistleblowers I've interviewed have said better in issues large and small, have said better to have tried and failed than not to have tried at all, because I can look at myself in the mirror in the morning and I can be a role model to my kids, even if I lost a job as a result of it or whatever. So and got some great comments and questions coming in. Let me ask about, Christy, did you want to add anything about futility?
No, I think everybody's got it. I'll echo just the tipping point notion. And the other piece I wanted to add is that if you're not investing in something that you find problematic, you might be investing in something that's better, right? And so also thinking about if you're going to sort of promote the boycott, if I'm not buying from Amazon, to use that example, am I investing in my local small business, right? So sometimes the choice might not be just to hurt Amazon, but to really make sure that I'm putting my effort, my resources into something that I want to see grow, and that works for cash money, and also I think spiritual commitments, if you will, to who you want to support in the world.
Great, lovely. I thank you for adding that. This may be a so just another consideration or another question is the nature of the media. And I guess how public or private the consumption is. So for example, if wearing an athlete's jersey when the athlete has been reprimanded by the NFL for domestic violence on video, taken on video in an elevator, for example. That seems to me to be different than deciding to watch the football game that person's in, or by, you know, and I don't just mean the ensemble piece, but I mean the sort of a jersey seems different than buying down or streaming a movie or streaming the music of a person. And maybe you can help tell me if you agree that the jersey is the more problematic consumptive choice and why, and maybe I'm just wrong.
Straight off the deck, the first thing I'd say is the jersey feels like a whole throated endorsement of the person. And watching the game both gets dissolved in the ensemble approach that you've described, and also it's got other things to it. There's watching the game, there's the other opposing team, there are lots of things happening. If I'm wearing a jersey that has someone's name on it, that very much looks like I, Christy Hurt, support that person, full deal. And I think that would give me a lot of pause and feels like a very big step away from keeping sort of my own ethics in alignment with what I'm hoping to put out in the world.
Really helpful. Other folks?
So I was wondering this intuition about the difference between jersey and maybe streaming music, how much that has to do with, like you said, the public versus private aspects. So imagine you're actually having a dinner party where 20 people were present. Do you still feel the same that, streaming a music from a problematic person seems less bad than wearing a jersey? Or to take the inverse case, suppose you do buy the jersey, but you will only wear this in private, right? And you will never walk on the street with a jersey. I mean, so I was just wondering whether your intuition about the difference is really tracking this. Is this a public display or is this a private enjoyment sort of thing?
Right.
It's a great question. I mean, for me, I think they need to be in alignment, right? I wouldn't wear the jersey at home either. I also wouldn't want my cash money to go to that person's image or likeness or name at its root. And so I'm not going to hide with my NFL jersey from the problematic player in my house, even if it's somebody who I liked a whole lot before they were known as an offender. And same with the music. I can think of having had a dinner party or a birthday party or whatever and had a playlist that I was pretty careful about how I curated it. Right. And so if somebody slips through because I'm unaware, that's a different story than if I am aware. It's probably not going to be on something that I'm going to promote in front of friends and family, and probably not blast while I'm vacuuming the house either. So that's part of, again, trying to kind of keep my own ethical alignment straight, even for myself. But I'd be curious if other people have a different reaction to that.
No, I mean, I think I have the same reaction. I think, the other side is thinking about if you're doing it publicly, the possibility, what is that message you're sending to other survivors, in your life, which you likely almost 100% likely you do. So what are they saying about, how could that potentially affect their relationship with you in the future when they see you? It's there's some type of endorsement in a way. So will they feel comfortable talking to you as much in the future after they see you endorsing that, almost like endorsing that person in some way?
So Melinda, when you brought up Michael Jackson, I flashed back to a wedding I was at in August where, they played Billie Jean and everybody danced. And I mean, it totally went over my head that it was Mike, I didn't connect the dots of his history, or it wasn't as present in my mind. And I'm thinking back and, I'm thinking, I probably would have danced anyway if I'd been conscious of it, but if I had not, probably no one would have cared. But also if I, stood in front of the band and said, no, Michael Jackson. I mean, it is sort of, I'm taking this to a bit of a ludicrous extreme, but it's also sort of where do we draw the line in terms of our actions and our imposition of it on other people's actions.
Kim, you just made me think of Melinda. Did you want to jump in? The era that I was thinking of is when students here at one of the clubs on Franken Street would have a boycott when they played Blurred Lines, the song years ago.
Right.
And there was a small group of activist students that would interrupt the DJ, right? And actually try to create some distraction, if you will, to have him stop playing that music, which I thought was really interesting, both because they were boycotting the song, clearly, right? Like they were opposed to it, but also I think because they were concerned about what environment playing that song would create for them as dancers, right? So I think that they were also aware culturally and socially in that moment, what playing the song would promote on the floor of the dance club. And so Billie Jean's a little bit different from that. Blurred Lines actually had a deliberate message in the text of the song about sexual assault. So it just creates a lot of interesting, I think, threads for conversation around what we dance to, what we don't, what we'll support, what we don't want around us, and all of that good stuff.
Okay, I just want to say I do not advocate stopping a DJ at a wedding. We just put that out there. It's going to make you look like the big jerk. But it is true. I mean, there's one thing to have personally boycott, different artists, but do you also have a responsibility to share this with others, to kind of advocate for others to also boycott certain artists? I don't know the answer to this, but that kind of would be, to me, would be the next logical step.
I think that ties in with a question we've got in the chat. So Dia is asking, is it fair to hold people of the past to our current ethical standards, given that our current standards will change in the future?
And we talked about that a bit, and maybe I can add another twist to it, and then you all can speak to this. I guess the other thing I would add to this is, who are we? In other words, is there, when we're saying, well, I would share with others why I wouldn't invest in this artist or this athlete, are we taking a holier than thou stance? Are we taking a moralistic stance that doesn't allow for things like grace and redemption, apology, enlightenment? And I mean, are we sort of fighting one wrong with another wrong, I guess, from an ethical perspective? So I'm just going to add that on to Dia's question, if I can, and invite somebody else to untangle it for me. Eric, you look like you're perfectly capable of
I will start
running into the fray.
Right. Yeah, I will start. So this is my idiosyncratic view, but I am someone of the opinion that it doesn't take all that much for us to make moral judgments of other person's character, moral assessment of the character. So, for me, I'm not as hesitant as some other philosopher to make judgments or assessments of another person. But caveat, it very much, so making a judgment about another person's character says nothing about what action you are to take subsequent to that action, right? It doesn't mean that you should call their employer and get them fired. It doesn't mean that you should stand outside their house and start protesting. But just when it comes to like whether I can make an informed moral assessment of someone, I'm someone who's not so hesitant. But I grant there are philosophers who are more hesitant. Now, let me just sort of bring to the table something that's closely related, which philosophers talk about a lot, which is the standing to blame, right? So a lot of philosophers proceed from the following thought that, look, suppose we have a course of an action and a person, and it's beyond any doubt that this person has done this horrible deed, and it's beyond any doubt that this person is very much blameworthy. So we have a perfect pure case of someone who's done a morally wrong action and who's blameworthy. There still might be circumstances in which we don't have standing to blame the person. Now, here are the three most often cited conditions. One, well, if we have done a similar action before, we might not have standing. That is, suppose we're talking about someone who engaged in interpersonal violence. Suppose Eric too in the past engaged in similar acts of interpersonal violence. Eric might not have the standing to cast the first stone, as it were. Here's the second condition. If Eric provided the necessary means for this person to commit this act of violence, then again, Eric might not have standing to blame because he was instrumental in getting this, in helping this person to commit. And the third condition is, suppose counterfactually, if Eric were in the same situation, he too would have done the same. Then that takes away some of Eric's standing to blame. The thought here goes, it's mere luck of circumstance that Eric didn't get into the same situation, but if he did, he would do the same. Now, I think one of the more, of the three conditions, the relevant condition to our discussion would be, did we provide the necessary means or somehow contribute to someone's commitment of interpersonal violence? And here's what I have in mind. One might argue that, at least in some cases of interpersonal violence, is due at least in part to a larger culture of maybe misogyny, larger culture of thinking that violence against women is okay. And then that leads us to the question, what's our part? Did we do our part in sort of eradicating this culture? Did we do enough to put a stop to this larger cultural phenomenon that might in part lead to this person's action? And if we did, then perhaps we too should bear some blame and that take away some of our standing. I did not explicitly directly address the question about what if the moral norm changed in the future. I guess I would just say one thing, which is that sort of our moral understanding or our understanding of morality, of course, will probably change over time. But sort of I am of the view that there are indeed certain objective moral truth. Slavery, as we talked about, is one good example. Is wrong now, is wrong then, even if people didn't realize it was wrong then.
That's a lot. First thing I just want to say, I personally have no issue with coming off as judgmental when it comes to intimate partner violence. I just want to go ahead and put that out there. Because I think no matter what the cultural messages are, there certainly have been people throughout history who have not committed acts of violence, no matter whether it was acceptable or not. Currently in our current culture, even though you could certainly argue that we have a lot of things in our culture that really promote violence, the majority of people don't commit acts of IPV, right? And I think I would take a gander that's been true throughout history. While there's certainly been plenty of people, particularly plenty of men who beat their wives throughout history, there also were plenty of men who didn't. And so to me, that's just not really, I don't know if I really see that as an excuse. And I don't also foresee that in the future, it certainly is true that our standards and morals will change. I don't really foresee violence certainly becoming okay in the future either with that. I mean, I do agree with the whole idea, I guess going back to the idea from the Bible of, let those of you without sin cast the first stone. But certainly there are plenty of us who, again, have never committed IPV. So I think we can stand in judgment of others who do. But I want to finish off with saying I also strongly believe in redemption. And I think we also need to make space for those artists who maybe have done horrible things, but have found a way to redeem themselves in some way. Unfortunately, I can't really come up with a good example of that right now, but I'm sure there probably are some, or maybe hopefully there will be some, because I do think we also need to make space for those who really choose to do the work and try to make it right, and try to redeem themselves in some way, and need to figure out some framework for doing that as well.
I'm on the same page. I mean, I think one of the reasons why I've always been drawn to this work is that it feels like a moral truth, right? Like that you don't hurt people. We've known that forever. We just don't do that. What I could see changing over time is how we frame what hurt is. And I think of emotional harm being something we gain more and more awareness of over the years, but I would welcome that reassessment over time. Because the part of the phrase a question that I sort of wondered about, I've lost, is what does it even mean to hold people to a standard, right? If I'm reflecting back, I think we're engaging in like a deep dialogue about it, about how that would sit vis-a-vis current culture. I think that's a really healthy point of reflection. And it kisses up against what Melinda just said about that redemption culture, right? Like we have to be able to dialogue about what has happened that's been harmful, think about it in current contexts and future contexts in order to figure out how to basically rejoin together as a whole community, whole society, in the hopes of being better next time. And I think as long as we're embracing that human condition and talking about redemption, and I too struggle to think of a really great example of that, I know we need to create space for it. And I think the principles of restorative justice give us something to jump off of in this area that can be really helpful. We know even from like criminal cases, folks who actually do go to prison around rape or sexual assault, domestic violence, which are few and far between. But when they do, for the most part, they rejoin our communities. And so figuring out even what to do with folks who are held accountable in a traditional criminal justice system, which, as I've said, is problematic and few and far between, most folks do come back. And so thinking about what we do to reintegrate them, to make sure they don't harm again, to continue to figure out what it means to have harm doers in our society. These are questions we have to be grappling with as we're thinking about all of this. So we may have some strong opinions about the ethics of consumption, but I think we have to be creating that space for that calling back in, reassessing, and figuring out what relationships look like and consumption looks like if folks are willing to take responsibility for what they've done.
And some of it, I mean, I guess this goes to another issue, which is sort of contextual, or if I'm using the phrase correctly, utilitarian factors. So the Rise Up anthem from R. Kelly was that came out after the Virginia Tech shootings was a very powerful rallying point. Often funds are used for victim reconciliation and victims assistance, restitution. So, and yet sometimes we're suspicious that people's rehabilitation is more for public relations than genuine. And I guess that's another judgment issue. So just, I guess maybe if you can, if there's anything more that you want to say about that little nuance I threw in, that would be great.
And I could just start by saying I think it's really tricky. And the examples that come to my mind are, I'm sorry.
I'm not sure if y'all are frozen for me here, so. Melinda, Christy, could you wave if you're?
Are we frozen?
You were,
Kim, while you're stuck, I can just start by saying I think it's really complicated. And one of the things I've given a lot of thought to is whether or not you would accept money from an organization that's sort of been in the penalty box for something related to interpersonal violence. I think of Uber, I think of the NFL, and both have given large donations to things like the National Sexual Violence Resource Center as they've been coming out of the penalty box, so to speak, after some high profile wrongdoing. And, you know, I have come to the conclusion that I am largely comfortable cashing those checks, right? And not that I've been asked to decide in those cases, but I think it would be, I would have to be very careful about what it meant for the other organization in terms of your question around rehabilitating their image, right? I wouldn't want the NFL, for example, to rehabilitate their image on the back of survivors. I do think if we could put that money to good use, I would want to clearly and transparently do that, but really be clear about what it does and does not mean for the NFL or for Uber. And I would be very hesitant to put big logos on a lot of the materials coming out of those efforts, because it sounds like that's where we started our conversation in the first place. It's that promotion of potentially a culture that would be harmful to survivors, would be triggering, would be a barrier, and so forth and so on. And so while I would cash the check, I would be very careful about how to frame in the agreement what that meant and how that did or did not absolve, if you will, the organization of culpability.
sorry, I dropped out. I couldn't, and now leaping back in. Are there other points to make in regard to the one that you were just discussing? Otherwise, I'm going to ask another question.
I think it boils down to, I don't think we as a society have thought enough about what redemption looks like. And I think it's a bigger discussion that really needs to be had. You know, what are some good parameters, you know, for what make, I mean, we don't even really talk enough about like, what is a real apology with that? What are, you know, so I think that's going to be kind of a whole separate discussion that I think we really need to have. I think right now, our kind of place society, it's kind of like, once you're bad, you're always bad. And I don't think that's healthy in any way. And it certainly doesn't give people incentive to try to grow and change their behavior. So I think that's a bigger discussion that really, I mean, yeah, and I'm with Christy. I have no problem with, you know, cashing a check if you can put it to good use. But an organization giving money or an individual giving money is not enough to really show that they've really redeemed themselves. There's got to be more, you know, certainly more than just words, and even just a check's not enough. It's got to be, you know, has that organization changed policies, for example? Do they now have a history of, say, supporting those who report? You know, that could be another kind of sign that they have really changed. I think it's even trickier figuring out if an individual has really grown and changed and really redeemed themselves. I have no idea what the kind of parameters are going to be there.
Kim, I think you're muted.
I was just checking. Sorry. Thank you. Thanks, Melinda. So let me, two sort of wrap up questions, and then I appreciate those from the audience and continue to invite those. Two questions. One about positionality. Christy, you kind of referenced it in your original point that your particular role in life's work, and I hear this from Melinda too, affects specifically these kinds of choices around these kinds of issues, and makes you particularly sensitive to the message that's shared. And so again, does race, gender, age, position affect that? How does it affect our consumption ethics? And then is this issue of interpersonal violence, gender, I hear it's special for us, but
It seems like Kim's having some connection issues again. So while we're waiting for Kim to reconnect, there's a comment and a question in the chat. So the comment first from Michael Smith, going back to the point about futility. As a parent, I try to take the long view on futility. My one action might not make an immediate difference, but my children see that, and maybe the next generation does better. There's a question from Michael Grigsby. Do you think there's an intrinsic connection between an artist and the art they produce? Essentially, is Michael Jackson's music the same as Michael Jackson as a person? Or can someone make a distinction? Is there the same connection between a consumer and what they consume? And those are for anyone, so feel free to jump in.
I'll say something, but again, I fear that my answer might not be fully satisfactory. So I would take the comment first. It is definitely true that it is a major premise of the futility argument that, well, your action is futile. And there are many ways to say, well, either it is not, or it might not be. There's a likelihood that your action will lead to some real changes, either now or down the road. And I think the comment points out that, here's another mechanism in which your action, even though maybe presently futile, could lead to some future changes down the road. So that pretty much just attacks the major premise of the futility argument. And I think that's another good reply. Now, the second question about whether we can separate, I'm just going to say the artistic value of a piece of work versus, I'm just going to say the moral character or moral quality of the author of that work. My general inclination is yes. So here's what I'm thinking. Again, so I will just use like a sort of mundane example. Van Gogh, rightly, when anyone teaches art history, they will have a chapter on him for the sort of historical importance, for the ingenuity, for his influence on subsequent development in the history of the arts. It sort of, even if I become aware or some new revelation about some highly morally objectionable deed on his part, I think there's, for me, I think, he should still, as it were, get a chapter when we write our art history. He should still be taught in art history classes. I mean, that's just one example. It doesn't really prove a general thesis, but it seems to me that we could, in some cases, distinguish the quality of one's artistic work versus, sort of the character of the person. And but I do want to emphasize the point that I said earlier, which is when you make a decision as a consumer, there are more things you need to take into account than the quality of the work, right? So I just want to make that point explicit.
Any other comments on the comment or the question? All right. At this point, it looks like Kim is still having some connection issues, but wanted to open the floor.
I'm here verbally, but I appreciate you subbing in for me, Matt, as needed. And yeah, if there are other questions, feel free to feed them to the group.
So it looks like we've got a question from Tristan. Do you think that we can appreciate the work/art that people with morally ambiguous backgrounds produce? Or should they have to be generally morally righteous for us to ethically appreciate their work?
I'll start, at least start on that one. Yeah, not certainly all as humans, we have our faults, but to me, there's a big difference between an artist who, say, cheats on their spouse versus an artist who, is abusive to their partners. And it's more than just, I certainly don't have an expectation that, every artist I consume is a perfect person, is always morally right. But to me, there's a big gap between that and choosing not to consume art made by those who have engaged, in a pattern of abuse or have committed some horrible act of violence. To me, there's a big difference between those with that. I mean, others may certainly disagree with that, but I guess that's kind of where where the stand I see.
Yeah, I think it goes back before. That's why I think this work is appealing to me, because there is clarity, right? It's not ambiguous to me about someone hurting a child, hurting a partner, hurting someone else in any form or fashion. And so I don't think any of us are morally pure, right? So that's an unachievable standard. And so if I couldn't use that measure, but I can't, and it's not even just a like virtual signaling issue. I don't enjoy the art as much, right? I can't enjoy it if I know who the person was and that they hit their spouse, hurt their kid, raped someone. It changes my experience in a way that's not even intellectual. It's emotional and it's at my core. And so I think that those are very different things that for me are easy to separate. Having spent a lot of time, of course, talking to people who've been harmed, it makes it much more clear. And I think that that's just one of the challenges in this conversation is when we start talking about moral ethics, this one for me is just so clear. It's not a question.
Great. Before I dropped out, I had sort of poised the question about positionality and also nature of offense. Did that get kicked around, or did you go on to something else? I apologize.
You may want to restate the question, Kim. You broke up as you were framing it.
Great. I'm actually going to unvideo myself to try to increase whatever bandwidth I have here. So my question had to do with, Christy had said at the beginning about her role and her dedication to this field increased her sensitivity and her threshold to this. And so I wonder about the role of our jobs or our race, gender, other identities in the importance of consumer ethics and making discernments. And then the other question is, does the nature of the moral violation matter? In other words, if someone doesn't pay their child support or they're convicted of fraud, do we judge that differently than or does everyone have their own moral threshold or moral lens that they hold actors and athletes to? So 2 questions. Eric, you're nodding. Maybe you want to start on it.
I will start just, make it quick because I feel like the other 2 panelists are way more qualified to speak on at least the positionality issue than given their experience than I am. So maybe I'll just focus on severity. So I think the severity of the crime or the severity of the moral graveness of the act, to me, if I reflect on my own personal intuitions and thinking definitely makes a difference to my decision about whether to support the artist or not support the artist, or related actions with respect to the situation. So so if the question just posed to me, does the severity of the crime or act matter? I'll just give a simple answer, which is yes, and I will let the other panelists chime in.
I mean, I do think that positionality and who you are matters in this. I think we all have our own individual sort of long, dark nights of the soul to have around how we want to spend our money and use our time on this earth, right? So that's all very personal. But I think in this space, certainly professionally, I've been clear that I think it matters what I signal out in the world. And I think that can have a direct impact on who talks to me and what my work looks like. But I also think there's another element that you asked about in the question in terms of like race and gender and sort of personal identity in this work. And I think that should influence this, or does influence this conversation as well. And I think about it in the context of what I promote that more directly. I think, there's been a lot of conversation in the press lately about folks who have been posting on social media about Gabby Petito's murder, right, and her disappearance, but then have not had similar postings about the hundreds of missing and thousands of missing Indigenous women across North America. So I think, it doesn't always just come across in terms of what you consume and what you promote and what you purchase, but also what you promote as a cause. And being aware of your individual identity, I think does put you in an interesting position to really make sure that you're looking at the issues that you care about holistically, whether that's interpersonal violence prevention or something else. But being aware of who you are in the world and what you're putting out there, I think matters in all sorts of circumstances and based on a variety of different identity lenses.
Melinda?
I don't really have anything else really to add on that. Again, I also just want to point out there that there certainly are lots of people who may not have any obvious connection to IPV who also have taken these strong stances. So it may be because they are survivors and haven't chosen to share that with people. They have a lot of survivors in their life, et cetera. If they took a women's studies class in college, whatever the reason, it's not always kind of obvious who's going to be the big advocates for this or not.
Thank you. If there aren't other questions, I'll just invite sort of closing comments or closing thoughts from you as panelists, either a sort of parting advice, something that you've taken away, or something that will enduring that might stay with you as a result of this conversation. I know that it spurred a lot of additional considerations for me, and so interested in closing comments. Whoever would like to start.
I'll start. I think I just want to finish with is that this is complicated. I don't think anyone has figured this out. I think certainly I would hope that no one would kind of beat themselves up over choices that they may have made in the past. That certainly, choosing to listen to Michael Jackson does not make you a bad person. I want to be really, really clear about that. I do think this is an area that definitely merits a lot more discussion. And I would invite all of you as you leave here is that consider discussing some of these issues we talked about with your friends and your family as well, because you may find that others are kind of struggling with similar issues or may want to just learn more about the issues as well. So I just say spread the word. And again, thank everyone so much for coming.
I agree that it's complicated. We don't know both who are the harm doers and who've been harmed in our society. And I am heartened by the fact that over the years that I've been doing this work, I've watched the culture change and that people are more willing to have these difficult conversations. And I think it's important just to remember whatever choices we make, that we want to make sure that we're aware of how our energy, our time, our resources, and our money invest in creating a culture for good. And however we choose to do that is a very personal and meaningful decision, and that small decisions add up. So thank you again for participating.
Yeah, I'll make it brief. So I'm going to echo some of the points that have already been made, which is that this is indeed a complicated and multifaceted issue. And sort of as philosophers, we often get asked, oh, you've told me all the relevant considerations, pro and con on this side and on that side, what's the right answer? To which I usually say, that's not really the rule of the business, or, that's not the rule of the game, or that's not really what we're doing. I hope, sort of by participating in this talk, I certainly learned a lot, and I hope everyone will walk away, sort of having a deeper understanding of what might be some of the relevant considerations at issue, but how to strike the right balance will, of course, depend on your particular situation, but also will depend on how you assign different weights to different considerations. So there's no formulaic answer, but I think gaining a deeper understanding is the first right step.
Fantastic. One of the things I often say in my work in ethics is just because you can't do everything doesn't mean you can't do anything. And so to me, that's a bit of each of us choosing our plot, and that it's not hypocritical or to make a personal choice about Michael Jackson, but not grab the microphone away from the band leader at the wedding reception and ask for different music. And also, I think, Eric, one of the points that you made that other folks mentioned is there's the decision, and then there's what actions we take. So the, boycotting someone's house versus just deciding not to purchase their product, I think is something I want to think more about. So, and in the spirit of continuing the conversation, we've recorded this, and so it will be available through our website at Ethics and Policy, the Ethics and Policy Office at UNC, and invite you to share the link when it's up, and to continue to visit and to join us for our other events during Global Ethics Month that are posted up there. Thanks, Matt, for bringing it. And it's really, really grateful to work with the three panelists. We're lucky to all be together in this space, and really thank you for answering my call and for bringing such great thoughts to light. So I wish everyone a wonderful rest of the day. And again, thanks to everyone here.